Welcome to Telling the Truth 2020 at the New York State Writers Institute at the University at Albany, State University of New York. I'm Mark Koplik, Assistant Director. A virtual symposium on politics, tribalism, polarization, and the future of democracy, Telling the Truth 2020 brings you conversations with major thinkers and public figures from across the political spectrum. We're perfectly astonished to be here today with best-selling poet, John Lithgow. He's perhaps the greatest chronicler in verse of this age of political absurdity, a man who has brought new vitality to the art of ridicule. If you have no idea who he is, you can find out more about him here on this website. His collections of satirical verse include Dumpty, The Age of Trump in Verse, and Trumpty Dumpty Wanted a Crown, Verses for a Despotic Age. They're incredibly fun and delightfully malicious, and you can purchase them via a link to an independent bookseller here on this page. You can also hear them performed by an all-star cast on YouTube, just an impossibly wonderful group of actors and public figures, from Meryl Streep and Samuel L. Jackson to James Carville and Pulitzer-winning science journalist Laurie Garrett. I'd like to ask you all, our online audience, wherever you are, please give a standing ovation to John Lithgow. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mark. That was just about the best introduction I've ever gotten, and certainly the only one that's referred to me as a major poet. You'll notice I burst into laughter when you said that.
So let's talk about satire. There was a sense that this administration might be too absurd for satire, even immune to it. Is satire still effective, and why do we need it?
Well, that's a big and broad question. There are a lot of answers to that question. But certainly the Trump administration is not beyond satire. Satire has exploded. Isn't it an amazing thing that every single late night talk show is almost entirely devoted to taking down Donald Trump and his administration? It's a booming trade. I'm amazed that there aren't more books of doggerel verse about Trump. Lucky for me, but you know, and Randy Rainbow, and just everywhere you look, there's someone making fun of this larger than life buffoon of a president. And what's fascinating about the satire and insult comedy that's directed to him is the stakes are so high. The issues are so deeply serious and frightening, at least to the people who are opposed to Trump. And there is a terrible, there's a terrible divide in the country, which makes it even more serious and grave. It really makes us fear for the future. In a situation like that, satire jumps into the breach, but it's very complex. You know, it's been fascinating promoting my books because the subject of satire itself is so interesting these days.
So Martin Van Buren, the 8th president and a son of upstate New York, was ridiculed endlessly in verse for his short stature and his fancy tastes. Mm-hmm. Comic verse used to be a standard weapon in political fights in the 18th and 19th centuries. Why isn't that the case anymore? And what attracted you to it?
Well, I think poetry in general has lost its place in the sort of intellectual and cultural universe. Poetry is certainly out there, and it's certainly important, and we have our great poets. But I think poetry, before radio and television and film came along, was a really urgent medium of communication. That's why you have people who study the history of satire. They study Alexander Pope and John Dryden and Jonathan Swift. I mean, these were, and Voltaire, I mean, major figures. And wit and the use of language was, I mean, just imagine if we didn't have television and social media these days, what how would we go about expressing ourselves? Language becomes much, much more important when a lot of thought goes into what you write down.
Are you amazed by what a massive creative project and public act of resistance that this has turned into?
That my own project?
Your own project, yeah.
I am. I'm completely amazed. It's not what I would have imagined doing 3 years ago. I've always been a kind of covert political activist. I've never traded on my celebrity, such as it is, to express myself politically. Maybe it's just my own kind of reticent nature, if not spinelessness, but I've never gotten onto the barricades. This happened, and yet this wit play and in fact, literary entertainment was a perfectly logical way for me to finally sort of come out of the closet politically. It all started by accident, really. I've told this story 100 times, and I hope I'm not repeating myself to your listeners, but the Oscar Eustis at the Public Theater asked me to perform at the Public Theater Gala about 3 or 4 years ago. And they have this yearly outdoor event in the Delacorte Theater in Central Park. This gala celebrated the Public Theater's history with music theater, so that there were pieces being performed from Hair and Chorus Line and Hamilton and Fun Home and all. And they asked me to perform the Major General's song from Pirates of Penzance, because they'd had a big hit with that in the 1970s. And I said yes in an instant. Now, this would have been about 5 months before the scandals surrounding Michael T. Flynn, just after Trump had been inaugurated. So I chose to do I Am the Very Model of a Modern Major General, as I am the very model of an ex-lieutenant general in full Michael Flynn costume and makeup. And I rewrote the third verse. When President Obama made me head of all things clandestine, he realized he'd brought to life a governmental Frankenstein. But then I made a killing in a case of public pillory by shouting, "Lock her up," in my harangue opposing Hillary. On and on and on. So I became the National Security Advisory until I let this crafty Russian Secret Service hire me. On and on and on. And I so blindsided the Public Theater audience that night. It was the last thing they expected on a night of sort of archival musical history. They absolutely exploded. It was a kind of triumphant moment of political satire, almost in spite of myself. And about a year later, just like I just sang it to you, I sang parts of that little song to my literary agent when we were trying to figure out what I should attempt to write. And the idea burst in his brain. He said, "There's your book. I could sell this tomorrow." And he did. So suddenly I was obliged to write about the Trump administration in verse. And I went back to all my favorite poets from childhood that my mom and dad used to read to me, Lewis Carroll and Edward Lear and A.A. Milne, a real kind of retro approach to making fun of Donald Trump, using language. A president who debases language, do everything I could to sort of elevate language, make it surprising and witty and clever and very, very fun to read on subjects which are giving everybody an ulcer these days. Treat lightly something that is very serious and in its way illuminating those issues.
Is acting related in any way to the art of caricature? Does an actor need to exaggerate the salient features of a real life character like Churchill or Roger Ailes? And is that related to your art as a caricaturist in verse and also in pen and ink?
That's a wonderful question, Mark. In all of these different areas where I've dabbled, I consider myself a very good actor. I'm an amateur poet and an amateur illustrator. I'm a professional actor, but there is a performative aspect to this. All of these poems I write with a view to speaking them out loud. The minute I would finish writing them, I would read them to my wife. I became insufferable among my friends, spouting my poems and timing them and hitting the punchlines just so. I had a wonderful time recording the audiobook and creating those videos that you talked about, because they are performance pieces. When I contemplated launching the book, I proposed live events with hundreds of people. This is how I promoted my first book a year ago. But of course, with the coronavirus pandemic, we had to look for completely different ways of selling the book, but they were performative ways. And I approached all those great people, Alan Alda, Annette Bening, Glenn Close, and so on, because I knew they would do a wonderful job reading them out loud, and they did. So even when I did the illustrations in a sense were, I could imagine myself acting out the little scenarios that I portray in the illustrations. Joe McCarthy nursing a little baby Donald Trump with Roy Cohn in the background with a pram for the poem Joe McCarthy's Lullaby. This is all, I imagined that poem being very literary, but also very visual.
So the sketch caricatures really complement the caricatures in verse. And do you ever feel any sense of shame for mocking the physical appearance of your political targets?
Absolutely not. No, I mean, they deserve it. To me, they brought all this down on themselves. These are people who have enabled appalling behavior. The very interesting thing is, I suppose if I ran into Rudy Giuliani or Anthony Scaramucci or any number of people, Jared Kushner, there would be a certain unease because I have insulted them with both poems and drawings. But I mean, how can you resist? They are so larger than life. They are caricatures of themselves. Actually, I've dipped in a little bit to caricaturing them in performance on the Colbert Show, performing Rudy Giuliani. I don't know whether he's seen that, but in my mind, it's very, very accurate.
Rockabye Babies about an infant falling out of a tree, Ring Around the Rosies about a pandemic. Nursery rhymes are often perfectly horrible and adorably cute at the same time. And some artists like Edward Gorey and Lemony Snicket and you have made fruitful use of that peculiar combination. What makes that so attractive?
Well, it comes very naturally. There was an interesting example of why I resorted to very simplistic nursery rhyme approach. I brought my recent book here. I didn't bring last year's book, but there's a poem in it called Jared and Muhammad, which is about the unholy bond between the US and Saudi Arabia, Trump and bin Salman, and Jared Kushner's very particular bond with bin Salman, and the kidnapping and dismembering and murdering of Jamal Khashoggi. I mean, it's who would have dreamed that that was the stuff of a nursery rhyme? But I thought this poem, this subject definitely belongs in this book because it's one of the most appalling things about those 4 years of the Trump administration. So I set about to write it, and I had a terrible time. It was just too gruesome. It was too appalling. And I realized I'm writing this in a very, very kind of long rhyme structure. It was, and I struggled and struggled to tell the entire complex and difficult and appalling story. And I just simply couldn't do it. And then my inspiration was to shorten it and make it very stupid. really tell it like a Mother Goose rhyme. Jared and Muhammad were a very lucky pair. A silly little rhyme, which eventually tells the entire story of Khashoggi getting murdered and dismembered, and with blood on Jared Kushner's hands. And to me, it's one of my strong poems. It's very ghoulish, but it's a story that people have got to remember. I mean, in my mind, this whole project was about making these 4 years as memorable as I possibly could, and memorializing very, very dark moments by treating them cleverly and lightly and almost as jokes. Because it's very important that we not forget this.
And the news cycle moves so quickly, and the White House is such a revolving door in many ways that you really have emerged as kind of a chronicler of these moments that we might otherwise forget.
Yeah, it's very interesting. There's only about 4 people who have lasted this entire 4 years. One of them is Trump, of course. Mike Pence, yes, but also Jared Kushner, Ivanka, and Stephen Miller. They're the only ones who've lasted all this time. Everybody else has either quit or been fired, mostly fired, and very few of them have walked away with any honor whatsoever. And that's about 80% of the subjects of these poems. You asked a little bit a while ago about whether I felt shame about making these people targets. I mean, look, Trump himself turned on them, not much more viciously than I have. And to your other point about how these in effect are little history books, yes, I began to realize that quite early. Everything I make fun of is eclipsed the following morning. So I decided, well, think of this not necessarily or not completely as poetry books, but as history books. It was very funny, interesting that it took me, a year between the bright idea of the book and the actual publication of the first book. By the end of that year, having written poems all year, the book was published, people would read it, and so many times the response I would get would be, oh my God, I forgot all about him, or I forgot all about her, because they were from the first half of the first year of Trump's administration. When's the last time you gave a single thought to Tom Price or Scott Pruitt or Ronnie Jackson or Anthony Scaramucci himself? They were just left by the shoulder of the road, miles behind us. And it was very important that a book be written to make them memorable, because we must not forget what's happened.
You brought up meter a while ago, and reminded me of Robert Frost. There's that famous quote that free verse is like playing tennis without a net, and most modern poets have avoided rhyme as a kind of encumbrance. Does rhyming sometimes prevent you from saying exactly what you want to say?
No, I found it fascinating. Eventually, I could pretty much get everything in. It was very, very difficult. I mean, I would spend entire days thinking about nothing but rhyme and meter, and I'm very rigid about it. I'm as is Stephen Sondheim. Every syllable has got to be right, and the emphasis has got to be exactly right. And you can't every vowel and consonant have got to be correct in the rhyme. It's like telling a joke. If somebody coughs in the middle of a punchline in front of a big audience, there is no laughter at all. If there's the tiniest thing wrong. The same is true with verse. A single line has got to hit. Every accent has got to hit, and the last word has got to be the punchline kicker. It's just exactly like telling a joke on stage, and you can't mess around with that. And that's not true of all poetry, but it is true about comic verse, I think. I mean, there's a wonderful delight and surprise to coming. I wish I had wonderful examples at my disposal, but well, give me any one of my poems, and the last line will be something delightful. Here's the end of a poem about Jim Jordan. I don't quote this very often. Jim Jordan, Buckeye firecracker, ex-enforcer, ex-attacker, Doberman who's lost his bite. Nothing can relieve his plight. The voice that stoked 1,000 fears now falls on deaf, unheeding ears. Jim's history has knocked him flat. Hubris pinned him to the mat. It's all about him being an assistant wrestling coach and being ensnared in a sexual harassment scandal. Every one of those beats and every one of those rhymes is impeccable, if I do say so myself. And it has to be, or it's not funny. And that's not a funny subject.
So I asked my 8th grader to recite the original Humpty Dumpty from memory. He was a little weirded out by that and a little angry. And he got some of it, but not all of it. And I had to prompt him. Nursery rhymes have been a universal cultural reference, but some people worry that they're in danger of disappearing. Do we need to save nursery rhymes?
I just love your questions, Mark. It hadn't even occurred to me, but I think you're absolutely right. Nursery rhymes were in our DNA, us people over 70 years old. And I don't think that's true nowadays. I mean, I could spout 20 Mother Goose rhymes. I mean, most people my age could. I don't think that's true of young kids now. It hadn't even occurred to me, but whoever thought of nursery rhymes as an essential art form? I don't know. I do think that I remember there's a wonderful woman's children's book author. I wish I could remember her name. She was asked why she was so good at writing for children. And she said, well, I was a child myself once, and I haven't forgotten a thing. Well, the things from my childhood, I remember so vividly. I could spout the owl and the pussycat, or the walrus and the carpenter. I mean, and yet I could not possibly speak the lines I learned to perform 2 weeks ago in a TV series I happen to be working on at the moment. There's something about a child's brain that is, first of all, it's wide open. It's extraordinarily educable and imprintable on. And I think those are essential years. And I think it's very important to read to children and to ensorcel them. They should hear the magic of language early on because it sticks with them their whole lives. And of course I worry about that in a digital age, not to mention a learning at home age.
You mentioned that you were kind of a reluctant activist. Have you grown more comfortable as the Che Guevara of comic verse?
Well, oh man, you're making me feel awfully pleased with myself, Mark. The Che Guevara of comic verse. I'll remember that for sure. Yeah, I get on, good Lord, I get on network talk shows and spout off with great insouciance about my politics. Of course, as I say, all the talk shows, they're on my side. I don't know, it's just this, Donald Trump has dragged me into the public arena. He's the first politician who has truly enraged me and appalled me and scared me. I was not a fan of Dick Cheney, but he wasn't the president, and he wasn't nearly as reckless as Donald Trump. He didn't go after institutions. He used institutions to promote policies that I I strenuously objected to. Donald Trump is just simply destroying the institutions. He intends to make himself the only institution of government. I mean, that's the bottom line. And besides his person, his entire bullying attitude, everything about him just enrages me. And yet I'm not quick to anger. I just feed all my rage into some other way of expressing myself. As an actor, I'm accustomed to expressing other people's words. And it's only here in my old age that I'm expressing myself with my own words.
If Hollywood is as liberal as people say, why isn't it more effective in promoting liberal values to half the country?
Boy, that's a challenging question for me. For one thing, Hollywood is all about entertainment and fiction. I mean, all of us performers, we are total frauds. We lie for a living. We play parts. What I just said, we speak other people's words. You know, what is her name? Natalie Maines, the woman from Dixie Chicks who was defamed for, basically the Dixie Chicks were destroyed by one sentence. And the phrase used about her was shut up and sing. I do think there is that attitude about us performing celebrities. People absolutely rely on us to liven up their lives and entertain them. People can't do without entertainment. They're starved for it. But many people just want us to entertain. They don't want to hear about it. It's a wonderful thing for an actor to be able to act in something which deeply expresses things that you really want to say, ways of expanding people's consciousness and reaching them on both an emotional and an intellectual level. That's a great thing. Examples of that were when I played Roberta Muldoon in The World According to Garp, an extremely sympathetic portrayal of a transgender woman 40 years before this became kind of a cause célèbre. Love is Strange, a wonderful small movie I did with Alfred Molina about 5 years ago, just when marriage equality was a major issue. We played two old gay men who'd been together for 40 years and finally had the chance to get married. Really one of the loveliest movies I've ever been in. M. Butterfly on Broadway, which was the first and pretty much the only major hit straight play written by an Asian American playwright about the whole dilemma of how the West perceives the East in a general way and how Asians are perceived in our culture in a slightly more specific way. An amazing piece of theater that had a big, bold idea that totally blindsided audiences. You get to perform someone else's vision, and it's an exhilarating feeling. You feel like you're doing something not just entertaining, but important. And it is, you know, I'm not a gay man, but this was Love is Strange was a very important gay film. And sort of on behalf of gay people, I was so proud of it.
One of the unifying themes of this symposium is whether it's possible to reach out across the political divide. And you do that wonderfully in kind of tongue-in-cheek fashion. In the introduction to the first collection, you implore Trump supporters to open the book and look at the drawings, even if they can't handle the rhymes. Is it possible to connect on any level with folks on the other side? Are you hopeful about that?
Well, I'm always hopeful. I'm an optimistic person, and I'm in the empathy business. I try like crazy to put myself in their shoes, Trump supporters. I even try to put myself into Trump's shoes. If you read the poems carefully, there is a certain thread of empathy, indeed pity, for Donald Trump. I do feel badly for him. I mean, to me, he's a very troubled and hurt person. And that unfortunately manifests itself in really damaging behavior now that he's gotten hold of power. And I certainly hope that he's voted out of office. And I hope he's held to account for all the damage he's done to our politics and our society and culture. But some of my best friends are conservatives. There is almost an agreement we're going to steer clear of politics. But just by virtue of the fact that there is a friendship there, sort of gives me hope. I just feel what I'm hopeful for is that the scales fall from people's eyes and they see Trump for what he is. And he's cooperating with that. I mean, the last couple of weeks, he's behaving completely berserk, as I think there's a real panic in him that he's going to lose this election. I look at him and I think, how can you possibly vote for this man? But the empath in me reminds me, the other side of me, that, well, there's a good 1/3, if not 1/4, if not half the country who is captivated by this and reassured by this. They think, oh, we'll be so much better off if he's reelected. I mean, I have to remind myself that half our country feels that way. But I do think we are blessed with Joe Biden. Knock wood, if he becomes president, I think we have a good chance of reaching some sort of rapprochement between these two crazy sides of our country.
Last question. It seems like your work could find a permanent home on an editorial page like Doonesbury or political cartooning. Is this a long-term project or are you done?
Well, I have another book to write. My book deal expects another one from me. I have a lot of thinking to do after the election. I think either I'll continue to chronicle this nightmare, or I'll write a book of children's poems, because after all, that was very much the inspiration for this book of all things. And I also take very seriously giving really wonderful entertainment and wonderful literature to kids. This is not the first poetry books I've written. I've written 9 children's books of rhyming verse for kids. I sort of have to remind myself of that when I talk about how this is the first time I've ever written any poems in a book form. I've been doing it for years, and I think I'm happy to return to that. I will be enormously relieved if Trump is giving me no more material.
The books are Dumpty, The Age of Trump in Verse, and Trumpty Dumpty Wanted a Crown, Verses for a Despotic Age. You can purchase them from a link to the Independent Book House here on this page. And you can also find wonderful readings of the rhymes on YouTube, the Trumpty Dumpty Cycle. John Lithgow is one of America's great thespians, and its preeminent doggerel poet. John, it's been so much fun. And
Mark, you're just wonderful at this. You are such a good interviewer, and I'm a connoisseur.
And please check out the many conversations featured here for Telling the Truth 2020. To our online audience, thanks for joining us. Be well.
Thanks so much, Mark.